I just want to address dynamic range compression, dynamic range reduction. Two aspects of that are for reducing dynamic range because of problem audio with a dynamic range and decibel level that's too far apart, or something's peaking too loud, or transients and things like that. And the other is for trying to color the sound. Now, when you're using your compressor, that its main purpose is to try to bring any transients or any loud volumes down closer to the zero, so that you don't have, if you've got peaks going on in your audio, that you can reduce the range between this top part up here, and zero, so that you don't have as many problems with peaks or really high jumps in volume, to where it's staying around here and jumping way too high up here and coming way down and jumping way, to try to reduce that dynamic range. And that's a very simple concept. That's what it does. It's not any more complicated than that. And that's what its purpose is. I've seen people try to use compressors for all kinds of stuff, and I'm like, why would you do that? If you don't need a compressor, don't use it. Its purpose is to help you try to deal with issues like that if you need it. If you don't need it, don't use it. I mean, if you think you need to pull a compressor out on every mix, that you got some kind of problem, because you shouldn't have to. That's not what it's for. It's to help you in some areas. And even sometimes I won't pull out a compressor. I got this area right here. I've got one or two of these that do a whole track that are peaking up somewhere. I'll go down and zoom in on it, and I'll go down and zoom in on it and cut on either side of it at zero crossing, and then reduce that, manually, so I don't have to put a compressor on there. I don't want to compress it. I'm compressing the audio can change it. The more processing you do, the more it can change the audio, and especially if it's emulating something analog. I want clean compressors if I can use it, but if you end up stuff like that, it may change the audio. So that's the purpose of it, is try to reduce that range from those highest peaks to zero, and try to bring them closer together in case you have issues. There can be some times where you can use the compressor for that and actually do some coloration with it, but it normally isn't that significant. From what I've seen, and I've used it on a lot of samples, a lot of tracks, and a lot of music, that it really doesn't do that much. And I see some people, I'll watch them switch back and forth, and the volume when they go to, they put it on and they turn it off, and the volume difference between those two make them think they're getting some kind of coloration that ain't even happening. So you got to be real careful of that. Like I said, I'll put maybe 1.5 dB of compression on something a lot of times, just if I'm having an issue, and then I'll look and listen to it, see what it's doing. Sometimes up to 3 dB of compression. I'll go to like 3 dB of compression on there, and just kind of see what's happening with it, and I won't go up much above that. If I got to go above that, then I'm normally having an issue, I'm like, well, something's really wrong there, and I better maybe approach it a little bit differently. But sometimes there's some things that you can compress the living shit out of. You got some heavy metal guitar or something going on that's going to really alter the sound, and that can be a purpose for it too, but that's a fairly abstract purpose. This tool, that's like using a screwdriver for a hammer, it's like, that's what it was made for. Does that make sense? So, that's basically, I hope I made that real clear, so that, the actual purpose of the compressor and what it's doing when you're trying to use it to reduce the dynamic range, what that means. And that's really simple, and I hope that was very clear. The other purpose that you have for doing true dynamic range reduction, true dynamic range compression, to try to color a sound is something different. Like you've got a multi-band dynamics is a really prime example of that. Because if you've got a multi-band dynamics on there, and you've got this piece of audio that you're listening to it, and you can see that you can listen to it, and these three frequencies right here, you're trying to reduce the dynamic range between their decibel levels and this other stuff, the decibel levels of this stuff down here, to color the sound. to change the sound, to color the sound. And so, I mean, if you watch it there and watch where those are going when I turn this on, how much they drop down. Now that totally altered the sound of that timbre and that instrument or that mix. I mean, it's going to alter the entire sound of it. You're doing true dynamic range reduction of frequencies and the decibel range and the levels between certain frequencies and different areas of frequencies, doing true dynamic range reduction. And so when you're doing, you understand the difference of that, so that that kind of stuff can be really great for a mix. It can be really great for samples or for instruments or anything. And with automation following it around, that you can shape a whole track that way. It's really hard to use that unless you do the automation for those parameters follow the actual timbre's fundamental frequency around and the timbres you're trying to compress, so that it does it through the whole track the way it's supposed to, rather than coming in and out of the range that you've set to do compression on. But that's something that's kind of an add-on to that, but that's the purpose of it. And with that, then you're doing coloration, true coloration. And you can be doing that in the upper frequencies. You could be doing that up here to try to do something with the mid part of the timbre, or the upper end of the timbre, or the very high part of the timbre, trying to compress that, do dynamic range compression on it to try to reduce that. But that's a little bit different. You're actually trying to compress those. The true dynamic range compression is you're trying to bring these higher parts of this timbre down closer to the other levels of the other timbres, doing dynamic range compression of those timbres, so that whatever's louder is coming down closer to whatever is softer. Does that make sense? And so that you're doing dynamic range compression between these peak levels up here and these peak levels over here, so that you're actually doing coloration of the sound. And I hope I made that very clear and very simple, so that that's not confusing at all. Implementing it with automation and doing it correctly, and doing it, it's always to go light. Go a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time, and see what it's doing. Does that make sense? And well, that's with most things. But there you're going to get coloration, and not just that. You understand the purpose between those two instruments and what they do. Those two tools have very specific purposes. And like I said, I mean, screwdrivers for, unscrewing and screwing in screws, but sometimes it gets used for a hammer, and that might happen here also every now and then. I've seen them do it with compressors all the time. But, you'll hear that myself, that if I don't need a compressor, I don't never see a compressor on a track. If I don't have to put a compressor on there, I'm not using it just because it has some cool flashy lights, or I know how to use it. It's like it's got a purpose. And if I don't need it, then I ain't going to use it. And I'm hoping that I've done my job well enough to where when I get to the point to where I might have needed a compressor, that I don't need one, because I made sure way beforehand that I wasn't going to need one. And hopefully that the guy that was performing, he didn't do something that's going to cause me to have to use a compressor, that he did a good job on his performance, and his dynamics in his performance are well enough to where I don't have to use a compressor on it, because I don't want to if I don't have to. It's a have-to kind of tool. So I hope I made that kind of clear, and I hope there wasn't anything confusing about that, and that you can understand that dynamic range compression and the two different types and what their purposes are and what you can use them for. There may be lots and lots of purposes that you can use those for, but the basic understanding of what they do is that simple. And the other thing you might run into is that you go over here to your compressor, is that, if you've got a compressor that has a separation on it, kind of like a multi-band dynamics, but even a low and a mid and a high to compress certain frequency ranges, that you can do true dynamic range compression with that also. And, actually reducing the range between the peaks of different frequencies to bring them closer together, to try to, do dynamic range compression, trying to bring higher level frequencies closer to those lower level frequencies to try to do actual coloration. And that's a different purpose than trying to just do compression on a track to try to reduce dynamic range because you have, spots in it that are loud as compared to spots on it that are really quiet, that you want to reduce that range. And I know that sounds like the same thing. If it technically it sounds like the same thing, but in reality it doesn't work quite the same way, because those are two different applications, and they will do different things. You can try to use your compressor all day long to try to color a track like a multi-band dynamics that I was just showing you. It's not going to do it like that. It won't color the tone that much. It's going to squish everything down closer to zero. It's not going to just pick a few frequencies and squish those down and not the other ones. It's squishing everything down closer to zero. If that makes sense. Rather than the multi-band dynamics, which is pushing those frequencies down to where they're closer to the level of those other frequencies. Does that make sense? Now, you can totally squish the living shit out of something until everything is really close to zero, but you'll find that most of the time that means all the shit in your lower decibel frequencies are going to completely disappear during that process if it doesn't start sounding like total crap while you're compressing it. So I hope that was very clear, and I hope that solves any confusion when you're hearing about dynamic range compression or dynamic range reduction and what their purposes are and what that's doing, so that when you pull out those tools to do work and to do coloration or to do dynamic range reduction because of transients or loud spots in your audio, that you're using those tools what they should be used for and have a really good understanding of what they're doing and when to use them. So I hope that helped a lot and that cleared that up, so that that is not any more a mystery to you, and that explanation was very clear, very basic, and very easy to understand. Peace, hope, love. Have a nice day.